In this lecture, we're going to be discussing the state of the architectural profession. So this is wrapping up all of the things that we've been discussing about different aspects of the profession of architecture, and it's a bit of a recap, kind of hitting on some issues about what's currently going on with the profession itself and, different issues with it. So when we talk about architects and employment, there are many different avenues or options that architects have in terms of practicing architecture or what they ultimately end up doing as architects. And, when we were talking about what happens in architecture school and the process of design and what you're actually learning, it really is problem solving. And so many times people who go to architecture school end up, in a variety of fields, not just architecture. And so what we're going to be talking about today are the ones who kind of end up in architecture, but there are many non-traditional or non-architectural jobs or employment opportunities that you could potentially have if you're trained as an architect. Now, when we look at just architecture, this is looking strictly at those who are practicing architects. The total number of architects in the United States, and this is according to NCARB. So keep in mind, NCARB is the National Council of Architectural Registration Boards. So they're gathering all this data from all of the member boards, which are the 50 states and the U.S. territories who regulate the licensure of architects. So according to NCARB, there are 105,847 registered architects in the United States. So, if we look at that and then we look at the AIA membership in the United States, you can see that not all registered architects choose to become members of the American Institute of Architects. And that's for a variety of reasons. AIA has continuing education requirements that are above and beyond the state registration continuing education requirements. It costs a lot. It costs about $1,000 a year to be a member. So some people just decide not to do it. But of the people who are AIA members and who are licensed architects, these are the statistics for what they're doing in terms of the practice of architecture. So about 3/4, 74%, are practicing in what we would think is traditional architectural practice. So they're in an architecture firm, and that could be anywhere from a very large firm with lots of different players, or it could be sole practitioners. And by sole practitioners, it just means you're a registered architect and you basically operate your own business and you have clients and work on projects on your own. So that's 74% of registered architects who are AIA members. So I'm getting these statistics from the AIA. I don't have statistics on all of the registered NCARB members. And then 1% are practicing in colleges or universities, 2% in government agencies, 2% in the corporate sector. And when we're talking about typically government agencies or in the corporate sector, a lot of times those are in-house architecture offices or architecture practices. So, for example, you might be working like for the, facilities agency of a state government, and you're still essentially doing architectural work. It's just not in traditional private practice. Often large corporate clients have their own architecture offices. A business like HEB has their own architectural staff in San Antonio that do design work and facilities work just on their corporate buildings and their stores and things like that. very small percentage are in construction. I think that is growing though, as people are diversifying in terms of technology and working in design build. Just looking at the statistics for the last several years, that seems to be growing a little bit. And then there are 17% who just didn't respond to the survey, and they're kind of unknown. But it starts to give you a picture of what people typically do. I'd say, most are in what we'd think of traditional architectural practice, but that doesn't mean that that stays constant. Throughout people's careers, they tend to work a variety of positions, and maybe they want to try other things, and maybe they pause from traditional practice for a while and go back to it, or do other things. So there really are a variety of employment types that you see out there with architects. The architecture industry itself is changing, and as we look at architecture over the last several decades, it's typically been a male-dominated industry, and mostly Caucasian. And when we look at the diversification of the industry, we can see some very small changes. We'll talk about that a little bit later on. But if we look at just the statistics of the architecture industry as a whole, if we look at what they're working on, like what projects they're doing, architecture firms owned by AAA members had gross billings of $26 billion. And we're talking about billings, we're talking about, that's not necessarily profit, it's just money that was billed to clients or paid by clients in terms of revenue for architects. And you often hear with architects about billable hours. It means, any hours that you work that are billed out to a client, and that comes in as revenue. Again, that's not profit because you pay your employees and you pay all your overhead, but gross billings, kind of before we talk about profit and overhead, it was 26 billion in 2011. And the 2011 number is kind of a good gauge, because this is like coming out of the recession, actually not coming out of the recession. This is kind of like in the midst of the recession. And so the picture has improved quite a bit for architects since then. Now, most of the revenue for architects is linked to, well, the majority, I say majority, it's just a little over half is new construction, and then just under half is renovations, additions, historic preservation, other projects. And that number, that renovation number, has risen a lot in the last 20 years, because, now when we think of traditional architectural practice, it's not necessarily this idea that you're going to have some pristine plot of land and you're going to scrape it off and build some building. Especially in urban centers, what you're typically doing is looking at adding on to an existing facility. A client might come to you and they have purchased something that was another use of a building, and they want to turn it into something that is useful to them. And so we might refer to this as adaptive reuse. So adaptive reuse just means that you're taking a building that once had a particular use and converting it to a new use, and that will generate the type of renovation, type of rehabilitation project that can be often a very challenging project, but typically a really rewarding one, because you're able to preserve either the building, or you're able to kind of keep that facility operational, or satisfy some client need. When we talk about architecture employment, we look at where architects are employed and what they are typically working on. We can see that there are quite a few in Texas, California, and in the Northeast and Southeast. Typically where there are large population centers, there are also going to be a greater number of architects, there's just more jobs, there's more building. And so we look at who is employed by architecture firms. So there are approximately 158,000 people employed by architecture firms. Now that doesn't mean all of those people are architects. About 36% of those are licensed architects. Those could be principals or partners. Principals are typically kind of the owners of the firm or partners of the firm, but they could also be, architects that are associates or non-partners that are licensed. About 16% are interns, meaning they're on the path to licensure or they're preparing for licensure. But as we looked at the path to licensure, that can be a pretty lengthy path. That doesn't mean you're in that pathway just for a few months. I mean, for several years, you could be considered an intern architect, and that's why we had discussed, the different terms that could be applied to an intern architect, because sometimes the term intern infers that you are just, temporarily in some situation and then you're going to be right out of it. But it can be a pretty lengthy process. About 13% are non-licensed graduates of architecture programs, and they're not pursuing licensure, and that could be for a variety of reasons. It's a lengthy process and expensive, and perhaps they will be in kind of the internship track at some point. And then about a quarter of employees, 22%, are other non-design and design professionals. So they could be, kind of allied professions like engineers, interior designers, planners, and about 13% are technical and non-technical staff. So that could be, people who are doing administrative work or other non-billable technical work. You might also have other categories where, maybe in that 22% you have somebody like a specification writer, where perhaps they're not an architecture graduate, but they have a technical expertise, and that would be considered billable technical work, because that can be billed to the project and billed on through to the client. And so, as you see bigger firms, they might employ a greater variety of people. So those 22% of employees that are other professionals, that's probably at bigger architecture firms where they have a greater variety of staff. The smaller the firm, it's typically going to be more architects and architecture graduates, and most of what you're doing is working on several projects. If you're working in a small place, you're probably doing a lot of different tasks and working on a lot of different projects, because it's kind of the all hands on deck approach. If you're working at a bigger place, you might become more specialized in something, because there are so many employees that you might specialize and work on maybe bigger projects, but specific tasks of those larger projects. Architecture firm size can really vary. When we talk about this would be like a mid-size firm. When you have about kind of 25 to 50 people, that's about mid-size. Less than about 20 is considered a small firm, or you might refer to that as a boutique firm. A sole practitioner is just one person kind of practicing by themselves. And then a large firm would probably be considered, kind of 50 to 75 plus employees. And the larger firms tend to exist in larger cities. It just kind of stands to reason. But a place like Austin has a lot of small firms, a lot of small design-oriented firms, a lot of sole practitioners, and there are just a handful of large firms here in town. So sole practitioners in the U.S. make up about a quarter of all architecture firms, so about 26%. About 3/4 of firms have between 2 and 49 employees. But that's a really big range. There's a big difference between having 3 people and 49 people. So, 49 is really kind of like a mid-range firm, and you'd have a variety of employees. But if you are anything beyond a sole practitioner, you fall into that three-quarters category. And then firms with 50 to 99 employees make up only 2% of firms, and only 1% have 100 or more employees. So you can see that the extra large and large firms are much more rare. So kind of that mid-range, mid-size firm that's like under 50 employees is the bulk of most architecture firms in the US. And that kind of goes with what's in Austin also. I mean, I'd say that that's a pretty fair assessment. I don't know exactly that it falls along those lines, but for a city the size of Austin, that would make sense that it was kind of falling in those ranges. And when we're talking about the total billings or the total revenue that is gained by those firms, about a quarter of the profession's total billings go to firms with 100 or more employees. And so you can see that even though that's just 1% of the firms, that they're getting 1/4 of the billings. And that also kind of goes to the size of projects that they're working on. So if you have the kind of horsepower to go after bigger projects, you need a lot of employees to back that up. Sole practitioners only account for about 2% of billings. And, that also kind of goes to the size of the project that you're able to get. So if you are a sole practitioner, you're probably doing like small residential projects or just smaller light commercial projects, and the billings on those are not going to be as substantial. When we talk about architectural clients, and I don't know if you can see this, you almost have to like back away from the screen a little bit. This is a house in Australia, and it has a brick facade, and it says hello, and the O is a window. And, a lot of times we forget about the client and the client's willingness to go along with the architect's vision for a project. So this took a very adventurous client, I think, to put this on their house. It's kind of a whimsical facade, but nothing can really happen without the okay and the money of the client behind it. So clients are kind of the lifeblood of the architectural profession. And when we look at how that's broken down, we can see who is kind of the majority of the clients for architects. So about 1/4, about 22% are commercial clients like business, industrial, or company clients, and about 25% are state or local government clients. So I don't know if that's surprising or not, but about half of all architectural clients are corporate or government clients. And so when we look at the breakdown of the rest, it's about 14% from developers, 16% from nonprofit institutions, 7% from the federal government, 4% are other architects or design professionals, and 12% from private individuals. So, only around less than 15 or 16% if you combine the private individuals with other design professionals. Not a ton of the general population are clients of architects. And, sometimes as architects we kind of lament that fact that there's not more accessibility to most people to use an architect. Billings are expensive. Often when we look at what buildings are getting designed by architects, a lot of them are commercial buildings. Some of that is, generated by the requirements for commercial buildings. You have to use a registered architect for commercial buildings by code in most places, and you don't necessarily need to for residential work. So it's kind of some interesting statistics when we look at who is actually hiring architects and who is paying for architectural services. Architecture firm revenues, we start to see these fall along the lines of, firm size and client makeup. But when we look at this is kind of an interesting take on where firm revenues are coming from. So about a quarter are from educational facilities, which is pretty interesting. So we'd refer to those as institutional clients. Any type of education. Now that's higher education. There's been a lot of building in higher education for the last 10 to 20 years. And that could include elementary and secondary education too. But a lot of that is from, especially in the last decade or two, is from higher education facilities. About 8% of the revenue from buildings are from retail and food service. When we talk about retail and restaurant, that could be considered hospitality. Sometimes hotels and other hospitality and resorts would fall under that category. About 17% from healthcare facilities. You see that with, hospitals and other healthcare facilities. 9% from office buildings, 8% from multifamily, and 6% from single-family residences. So when you think of all the single-family residences that are designed by architects, that really only accounts for a very small percentage, 6% of all the revenues for firms in the entire country. So, that's not a huge chunk, and it really corresponds to that kind of 12 to 13% of clients who are single-family residential clients. When we talk about the job duties and titles of, architects or people who are employed by architecture firms, it can vary pretty greatly. We often think of the principal or the partners of the firm, kind of the registered bosses of the firm, and perhaps their job is to go out and get new work and network with clients and bring in revenue. Perhaps they are a design partner. Perhaps they're in charge of different aspects of managing projects. But a lot of times the principals are kind of overseeing all the work and getting new work. And then when we look at other people who are pulling in work, it perhaps falls to people who are in process in their career to do some of the other duties. So when we talk about career patterns, that's kind of linked to job titles and job duties. So perhaps you might start out as an intern or intern architect once you graduate from architecture school, and you may be in that category for a long time. So that's why different states have made moves to call their intern architects various things like architect in training or associate architect. But then depending on the firm, you might move through different job titles. Maybe you are a project captain or a project manager where you're assigned various projects and you're kind of overseeing them, and then you report to the principals or the partners. There are drafters at firms where maybe you're part of a project team and you're doing a lot of the file management and modeling and drafting. Other, architects or graduates of architecture school, once you become licensed, you might become a project architect, which is you're kind of overseeing multiple projects, and maybe you're overseeing like managers of projects, and you're probably doing design work as well. So there are a variety of things that you might be doing, and when we talk about patterns of people's careers, they're not necessarily always on an upward trajectory necessarily. So you might start out at a small firm and realize you'd like to go to a place that's bigger, or vice versa. You might start out someplace big and try and get a lot of experience while you're an intern, and then maybe you once you become licensed, you leave and start your own practice and become a sole practitioner. So you do see a lot of this kind of pattern of turnover where, it's necessary at the beginning to work for somebody else, because by definition, you have to get all those intern hours, and there's no way to do that on your own. So you have to work under the direct supervision of a registered architect. So again, by definition, that means you're going to be working for somebody for a while until you're out of that internship phase. So, often when people go through that internship phase, they might get to the point where once they become registered, that they'd like to strike out on their own. Sometimes they'll partner with someone else, and maybe instead of becoming a sole practitioner, you might start an office or a business with one or two other people, and then that kind of grows. And as you get business, you can hire other people, and then you hire your own interns. So it often, kind of works that way. Some interesting statistics that are out there right now are that, the profession of architecture is a bit older now than it has been in the past. And by that I mean the average age of the AIA member, like a licensed AIA member, is around 54 years old. So what that means is many architects are going to be hitting retirement age in the next 10 years, but not a lot of architects have what we'd call a succession plan. They have this joke that you can either, kind of pass away, or you can just quit your firm. But, not many people think of the third option of handing the firm over to somebody else or having somebody succeed them. So oftentimes the plan is just to kind of work until you can't work anymore, and then other people tend to leave and start their own practices. So it's kind of an interesting time in architecture, because it will be interesting to see what happens in the next 20 or 30 years, if that pattern will continue of people kind of working up, getting experience, and then leaving, starting their own place, and then, have all these little offshoots, and then those grow, which is kind of typically the way that it's been in the past. Now, what has happened with larger firms is that if they have repeat clients, their clients are asking things like, well, what's going to happen if something happens to you? Do you have a succession plan for this firm? Because we have a relationship with the firm, and, not just with single individuals typically. So I think, the AIA and many people within the profession are starting to think more about that and how we can involve younger generations of architects in the process. When we talk about professional ethics for architects, the American Institute of Architects has a code of ethics and a code of conduct, but there are lots of different places where there are expectations of architects to be conducting themselves professionally and ethically and morally. There are certain things that you are expected to do or not to do as far as being registered or licensed. Just in general, to continue receiving your license and to renew your license, they ask every year if you've been arrested or convicted of a felony. They ask if you're paying child support. So for any of those reasons, they could choose to not renew your license. They have, in Texas, required fingerprinting, and they've run background checks on everyone in the last year or two. So there are all these kind of constantly changing facets of professional and ethical behavior that either the state that you're licensed in or the AIA will determine to be pertinent to your licensure. But in general, architects are expected to conduct themselves in a professional way and also in an ethical way in terms of how they serve the client, how they interact with contractors, how they interact with other design professionals. You're definitely expected to behave appropriately and work collaboratively and hopefully work in the best interests of those that you are contractually obligated to, typically the owner. But also, on the other side of that, when you're the architect, you're going to be hiring all your subconsultants, like all the members of your design team, such as structural engineers, landscape architects, interior designers. And so you're expected to treat all of those people fairly, just like you would any other employee. You're expected to pay them on time once they, turn in their work to you, that you pay them promptly and that you, involve them in all the communication that they need for the project, and that you are, giving them all of the reference information and everything else that the client is giving to you. So the architect is really relying on the subconsultants to do their work, and in turn, the subconsultants are relying on the architect to update them with any new developments, and then the client is relying on the architect to make sure the job gets done in a way that is efficient and on time and within budget. And so there are a lot of individual decisions that are made along the way where, I think a lot of people would say, well, of course architects are, behaving in a professional and ethical way. But, a lot of times there are budget decisions that need to be made. There are, material decisions and site decisions and all of those kinds of things. So you want to always try and err on the most responsible decision for each one of those things. And sometimes the client is not involved in all those decisions. They're really trusting you and relying on you to make the best possible decision on their behalf, especially since it's their resources, their finances that are involved in this, and they're investing in the project, and they're also investing in you to do the best possible job. When we talk about salary of architects, this is kind of an interesting breakdown when we look at compensation for architects by position. So the CEO or president of an architecture firm is typically going to make the most money. And when we look at this $131,000, that's going to be in an urban area where that's probably a president or managing principal of a pretty large firm. That's not really standard for architects. And, I don't want to give you the impression that that's a common salary for architects, because it's not. But when we look at kind of all of those, probably top 5, those are probably going to be in large cities at larger firms where there's like a chief operating officer or director of operations. That's not going to be like a sole practitioner salary, somebody who's just kind of working on their own from home or doing some small projects. But that mid-range is more realistic for somebody who's been working for several years and is licensed. Probably, anyone between like architect 1 down below all the way up to senior project designer. Any of those could be considered, registered architects, but with a variety of experience. So architect 1 may be like a newly registered person who has less experience, and there may be design staff or unlicensed architecture staff that don't have their license but have a lot more experience. So that's why there are kind of these intervals of architect 1 and then design staff 2, and they make more money than architect 1. So being licensed can help you in terms of compensation, but a lot of times they're going to compensate you based on the amount of experience you have and the amount of things that you can do. So that kind of alternates until you get to about architect 3. But really, architect 3 and up is probably at bigger firms, some of those bigger firms instead of mid-range firms. All of the kind of bottom half is more realistic in terms of a place like Austin and, at kind of mid-range firms. So intern 1 to intern 3, that would be somebody just starting out. like fresh out of school, and then you kind of work your way up from there. Now, when we look at salary by the areas of the country, this kind of makes sense when we talk about like average or mean compensation. And, this average is really high. I think they're talking about average for partners or presidents of firms, because this is not average for a typical architect or a typical architecture graduate. But this just kind of gives you an idea about which is more for, which region of the country. So New England looks like it's the most. And then when it talks about Pacific, that's really talking more about like San Francisco, Los Angeles, not necessarily like Oregon or Seattle. That pay a bit more in Seattle than in Portland. But when we're looking at like the South Atlantic and East, North Central kind of, Middle Atlantic, all of those are fairly close. The mountain states, that's probably the lowest, and it's might have something to do with the size of firms. They're typically smaller firms, less corporate billings. So that kind of gives you an idea of what it looks like across the country. When we talk about the profession as a whole, like kind of the makeup of the profession, traditionally it has been a fairly white male profession. Now, the curious thing about that is that now architecture school is fairly equal in terms of enrollment by gender. And there are many schools where there are more women than men enrolled. So, there may be like 51, 52% women. But in the last few years, there's been kind of a groundswell of some women in architecture who created this kind of grassroots organization called the Missing 32%. And this graphic kind of shows it, where the missing 32% means if you start out with half women and half men in architecture school, and that doesn't mean the beginning of architecture school. We're talking about like I guess architecture students, and then when we talk about architecture degrees, it's about 40%. So still not too much below 50%, but it really starts to drop between architecture degrees and then licensed architects and licensed AIA members. So when we talk about IDP interns, ARE test takers, it starts to go into the 30s, and then when you look all the way up to when it says AIA member principals and partners and licensed AIA members, that drops way down. So the missing 32% says, okay, if there are only about 18% of the total architect population are licensed women, then what happened? What happened to that 32% that started out in architecture school? And so there are a lot of people looking at this, and I think more people than were a few years ago, and saying, what can we do to keep women in the profession? And, it's not a simple answer. There are a lot of complex issues that are involved in terms of keeping women in the architectural profession. There are issues of, mentorship and seeing other women in the profession who are ahead of you, and just kind of believing it's possible to have a long career as a female. And that doesn't mean if you don't see someone else doing it, you can't do it, but it does help to kind of pull people through, when they see or have a mentor that is encouraging and doing the same thing that you're trying to do. When we start to look at some of the awards at the top of the architectural profession, we often look to these as gauges of where women are in terms of their significance within the profession. And outside of the profession, these are fairly unknown awards, but and often they make news maybe once a year when they're awarded, but these are extremely noteworthy, and they're actually good indicators of how the profession values that person's career. So the Pritzker Prize is given annually, and so is the AIA Gold Medal by the American Institute of Architects. And one example of this is in 1991, the Pritzker Prize was awarded to Robert Venturi, and Robert Venturi's longtime partner was a woman, an architect named Denise Scott Brown. And she did not attend the award ceremony in protest because he was given the Pritzker Prize by himself and not in combination with her. And the award committee's justification was, well, we don't give it to more than one person. And that's actually not true. A few years earlier, they'd given it to a couple of people. And since then, they've given it to partners, to male architectural partners, I think around 2000. But, it shows you kind of the level of respect that goes along with valuing traditional female careers in architecture, because there are very few that are regarded as having kind of like lifetime careers. There's also been a push to award posthumous AIA gold medals to some women, and that resulted in Julia Morgan being awarded the AIA gold medal more recently. Now, when I say more recently, I mean in 2014, Julia Morgan was awarded the gold medal as the first female architect to ever receive the AIA gold medal. And that was not to a living person. This was about, I think, 56 years after her death. She was awarded the gold medal, and that was the first female recipient. Now, Julia Morgan was notable for many things. She was the first female to be admitted to l'École des Beaux-Arts in Paris for architecture, which is extremely rare at the beginning of the 20th century. And she had a significant career that spanned decades. But for her to receive that so late after her death, but also to be the first woman only in 2014 is pretty astonishing. When we talk about racial diversity in architecture, we look at the kind of graduates of architecture and related fields. This is in 2012, 2013. And so when we see architecture in relation to other disciplines, like in relation to other majors and in relation to the U.S. population, we see that architecture really underrepresents various minorities and people with different racial backgrounds. In fact, the population of the U.S. as a whole is about 12 to 13% African American, and African American architects represent only about 1% of all registered architects in the U.S. So that kind of gives you a feel for, the majority of architecture licensees typically are white, and when we look at the relation of planning, real estate, architectural history, those are all, we refer to those as related or allied professions. And, architectural technology is a bit better represented, but still not, architecture doesn't even come close to all majors U.S.-wide for racial diversity. When we look at economic diversity too, I'm really talking about the economic diversity of architects themselves. And, there are various factors when we talk about access to becoming an architect. And when we look at not just racial or gender diversity, we really have to look at socioeconomic diversity, because the opportunity to become an architect really requires money and it requires means. And so as student debt has increased and the cost of college has increased, the likelihood that many people who are socioeconomically disadvantaged will become architects is not great. That's a lot of why we're interested at the community college level in at least getting people started on the path toward becoming architects if they choose to be, or at least becoming generally educated about architecture, because it provides greater access for less cost and also exposes a greater percentage of the population to architectural education, architectural ideas. Obviously you can't become licensed just by going to community college, but you can certainly kind of get on the path to getting interested in architecture or taking some classes or starting to become educated. A lot of what we look at in terms of coordinating with university programs, as far as community college goes, is creating organizations that will help students who attend community college kind of move up into that path. One of those organizations is the Coalition of Community College Architecture Programs. There are several community college architecture programs in the country, and in the last few years we've kind of joined together as a group to try and figure out how we can get a greater number of younger people interested in architecture who are from a variety of backgrounds, so that more people have the opportunity to study architecture if they'd like to, so that it's not kind of closed off to people who don't have the means necessarily to, who've traditionally been shut out of the process in terms of architectural education and architectural licensure. The future of the profession is pretty interesting because, when we talk about the diversification of the profession and, gender parity, gender equity, I hope that that is part of the conversation of the future of the profession. A lot of times when we talk about the profession of architecture, people tend to focus on the buildings and the product, but that's not really what's driving it. What's driving it are the people in the profession. So sociologically, we look at, the backgrounds of people who are architects, what they bring to architecture as a profession, what they bring to the design process, a greater variety of experience, not just with gender or race, but also with age or people who would like to get into the profession later in life. Those hopefully will all be opened pathways and opportunities for people who would like to be part of the profession. The other thing that will be interesting about the future of the profession is how much technology is influencing the practice of architecture, how much technology will influence the creation of product, the creation of buildings, and also efforts in sustainability. It will be it's kind of a unique time in history to see how we utilize the resources that we have going forward in terms of the built environment, how we as architects choose to, create new buildings, how we choose to adapt our current surroundings to changing needs and changing uses in the most responsible and sustainable way possible.